When I heard the rumour Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag was being remade, I audibly scoffed at the thought, partially because I couldn't bring myself to believe it, but also because I had next to zero faith that Ubisoft of the third decade of the 21st century would have the collective ability to recapture the magic of this 2013 great, meaning any remake could only ever be an inferior version. Well, when the game was revealed a few short months ago, I prepared to eat my words. Assassin's Creed Black Flag Resynced looked fantastic. For the first time in years, I momentarily felt the buzz around Assassin's Creed again. Those working on the game were saying all the right things. It was to be a faithful recreation of Edward Kenway's journey with a stunning graphical update, a gameplay update, and of course plenty of new content within this early 18th century Caribbean world that promised to remain true to Edward and by extension Black Flag.
The one thing that was non-negotiable is the original story of Edward Kenway.
It seemed the remake's intention was to preserve the integrity of the main narrative that Black Flag amazingly tells, to enhance the visual experience, to offer fresh new gameplay, and of course to expand the content in this world, because that, I suppose, is how remakes are like to justify themselves. More importantly, I suppose its intention is to add extra layers to the storytelling, and Ubisoft sure knew how to sell that. There were to be new scenes written by Darby McDevitt, Black Flag's original lead writer, and everything else was supposedly added provided it fell on the correct side of the rigorous question, would Edward Kenway do this? It would appear Ubisoft had actually, as the kids say, cooked. But, now the game's out, have they? No. Before you unceremoniously embark on a Reddit crusade to put me to the sword though, I wholeheartedly believe that Black Flag Resynced is an enjoyable game. Graphically, it's gorgeous. The underwater redesigns are so impressive, Ubisoft rewarded the Barcelona employees responsible for it by laying them off. Gameplay-wise, I'd argue the gameplay's no worse nor better than Black Flag originally did. You have a competent, albeit shallow, combat system, stealth works as well as it did in the original Black Flag mostly, albeit with an added crouch button, and the parkour system at this stage is what it is. Naval gameplay is just as thrilling as it was in 2013, and is maybe 10% less messy in the boarding bit. Overall though, I really don't know how to contribute to all of those discussions when you can find boundless videos praising Resynced for its visual updates, or deep diving on how the combat system differs from that of old, or indeed the assassination animations that are oddly imported from Unity. I bring it up merely in passing to preface that there's a game to enjoy here. Black Flag is here. It feels like Black Flag. The story still happens and it's still great. But all of what makes Black Flag Resynced good is purely the bar the 2013 version established, plus visual updates that are nice and mostly lateral gameplay steps that preserve the experience rather than enhance it necessarily. Well, mostly. But we'll ignore that. Beyond that, however, I see the rampant Ubisoft inexplicability on full display that plagued Odyssey and Valhalla, and the way I understand it, because I couldn't bring myself to play it, Shadows. The Animus Hub idea existing as a total substitution for a title screen is weird. Where's the sense of occasion? There's a microtransaction store where, true to Edward Kenway's character, you can dress him up like Sauron or a sea monster or something. Or you can buy time-saver resource packs. The only thing making it slightly better than Valhalla is the fact that you don't have to convert your money into a meaningless currency before you can buy anything, at set pricings entirely mismatched with the value of the items in the store, of course. I can't even complain about the Red Bull sales, because you have to go so far out of your way to get them that they're just kind of there if you want them. If any company's going to invent a time machine to advertise during the golden age of piracy and sponsor whaling, it's Red Bull, isn't it? All of those things are whatever at this point. Modern Ubisoft. However, what really baffles me is the addition of things, and of course, the removal of others. With these visuals, and this gameplay I suppose, all Ubisoft had to do was take that iconic Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag narrative, and port it into this game, and Ubisoft would have a successful remake on their hands. Perhaps as admirably as annoyingly, they weren't content to do just that. So they pulled Matt Ryan back in and presumably held him at gunpoint, had him, some other actors, writers, developers work up some fresh content, the quality of which, dare I say, exists in stark contrast to that of what was already there. They also ditched the original Modern Day, which I'll admit wasn't good to begin with, in favour of whatever this is. And while I get it, Black Flag now occurs twice in the Assassin's Creed continuity, if that word has any meaning anymore. They also reworked certain mission structures to avoid having as many tailing missions, which, in a way, I commend, but makes the mistake of assuming video game storytelling and mission structure don't interact at all, which just isn't true. But not every addition or adjustment is bad either. So, to keep myself from sounding too much like an arse, let's start with the good. I'm about to lose any notion of order, so forgive me. Firstly, I like that Duncan Walpole isn't pathetic anymore. In original Black Flag, your fight with him could be one counter kill, which is just not necessarily particularly impressive for a master assassin, even a wounded one. Now his immediate send-off is more impressive and ceremonious. He pounces on us from the shadows like you would expect an assassin to do. And then we get a boss fight where there's no chance where he goes down in one hit. Now he fights a bit more like a wounded, cornered predator. He's still an incredibly easy fight, but now there's a sense of occasion the original encounter didn't have. So that, in my mind, is a good adjustment. And I use it as an example to show that good adjustments exist. The next thing that I really like is the entirely seamless open world. It used to be that Havana, Kingston, and various other locations were their own world spaces accessed by a loading screen. Now they're seamlessly integrated into the world map, meaning you can board your ship and manually leave. I really like that because if you're going to be met with a loading screen anyway, it kind of incentivizes fast travel. Don't get me wrong, plenty about this game still incentivizes fast travel, but the voyage between, say, Greater Nagua and Kingston can now be experienced in its entirety, which is kinda cool. It was weird in Black Flag because certain locations existed as part of the wider open world with no loading screen breaking up the gameplay experience, and cities being their own world spaces altogether. The same goes for some jungle locations, but not all. Now that everything barring Principe, which is off the coast of Africa, is part of one world space, you can enjoy the game with far less loading screens if you want to. Don't get me wrong, the game is still torture without fast travel, especially with its frequency of storms that keep you from interacting with certain aspects of the game. And of course, naval choke points where you're almost certainly going to need to fight your way through, which gets kinda tedious. Another thing I really like is the inclusion of a photo mode. Every game kinda has one these days really, or at least it feels that way, and you can absolutely see why. Black Flag with a photo mode is a glorious idea. And what we've got here is probably not the deepest photo mode ever put in a game, but I've managed to capture some fun shots with it. Some are good, I think, some aren't, but, you know, whatever. It's one of the modern game trends I absolutely can get behind. Were I to improve it though, I'd find means to allow the photo mode to adjust the time of day, the weather settings. I'd have liked the ability to adjust Edward's stances, maybe toggle on and off the NPCs, alter the intensity of filters, and of course use the filters as foundations for manual adjustments. There's a lot that can be done to make it more versatile, but at the same time being able to capture your own high-quality screenshots within a game is always something that I take advantage of, so I would consider this in particular a win for Black Flag Resynced. And that's where I officially ran out of things to say about it while still having screenshots that I wanted to show. So that tells you just how much I used it, I suppose. Did it make my thumbnail making process any easier? No. But boy does pressing down both sticks and messing with this system scratch an itch. Of course, however, Ubisoft can't do a photo mode without somehow making it weird. You see, once taken, your screenshots are automatically uploaded to a database, which is fine, though I'd like the ultimate decision to make my screenshot public, thanks. But oh well, that's the way it's been since Origins. Anyway, where this gets weird is, like Assassin's Creed games featuring a photo mode before it, players' screenshots can appear on other players' world maps, which is nice when the screenshot is nice. However, Havana is now cursed with a feet pick, and I've watched this cursed thing climb in likes from multiple thousand, to 180,000, so I have a feeling it's not going away anytime soon, is it? I love watching Ubisoft's strange obsession with giving things a community focus when they don't necessarily need one backfire. To move on to other good things, I'm reasonably impressed by some of the world detailing. We can overhear NPC conversations and dialogue that may lead to things to find in the world, or may in fact just be there for the sake of filling silence. There are also world events to go and find. They're usually one-encounter stories that we can either interact with or sometimes simply overhear. For the most part, they're harmless additions that give the Caribbean some life. I will say they aren't always the most thematically relevant, which works out because when they are, they more or less spell out what Black Flag is about, which is just really strange. In my mind, they'd benefit from being way more subtle. Nevertheless, I can't really fault the idea to include them. As for another thing I quite respect, you can toggle your HUD up and down without using a menu. It's great. In original Black Flag, too much forced Edward's HUD down, which was particularly annoying when there was no way to pop it back up again. A lot still forces Edward's HUD down, but it's not quite as irksome when you can put it back up at your own leisure. Which brings me to another positive actually, the outfits. Generally speaking, the customization is what it is and I wouldn't care to make a thing of it either way. But when it comes to the robe assortment, there's a noticeably greater selection than there was in original Black Flag, and some of the new designs are really cool. The same can be said for a lot of the designs of the old outfits being imported into this game. Some still aren't very good looking at all, but others look incredibly good and interact with the lighting well. The legacy outfits even have physics that appear to be proper. I haven't managed to acquire all of them. I'm not particularly completionist, but for the most part the ones I've seen, which is a non-negligible number, the drip as it were is pretty nice looking. I also appreciate the unobtainable robes from Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag's community events. For instance, the Explorer outfit can be acquired here, and my god, what a corker. And I think all of that goes to show there are positive inclusions in Black Flag Resynced if you care to look for them. While we're at it, I also find the gameplay adjustments to the combat to be to my preference. I don't think it's any deeper than original Black Flag combat, but at least it isn't a scaled back version of Assassin's Creed 3's anymore. It retains a lot of the aesthetic value of Black Flag's original combat with Edward's takedowns and finishes, but it also sacrifices Black Flag's weapon variety baked into its environmental focus to the point where disarming or picking up weapons is no longer a thing. It is janky and hits a ceiling immediately, but I kind of like that there's something to figure out that I wasn't familiar with that retains just enough of the aesthetics to feel like I'm still playing Black Flag. But even then, it really does not solve Black Flag's combat's actual biggest issue, and that's the fact that after a bit, it just becomes a tedious thing to do. Every possible combination in combat, every single move you've seen and done before, and yet there's so much more of the game to go. So without getting too deep into it, I like that it tries to make Edward a bit of a glass cannon, but for a remake at best it's a lateral gameplay step, and with the complete annihilation of weapon variety, it isn't as varied. So ultimately what I like is the framework that it could be better. But definitively, is it? There's clearly an attempt by Ubisoft Singapore to strike a balance between what looks good and what feels challenging enough. Resynced's combat is mostly janky but with aesthetically pleasant elements. Yet, while I'd argue it's still easy, it's clearly far less forgiving than the original game. You can only take so many hits, your health won't heal on its own, there's an element of resource management in the form of healing potions, I guess. But were I to ask the key question, is this the definitive version of Black Flag combat? No. It may be more fun to mess around with for the opening few hours, but after that you have to wonder, should it be the definitive version of Black Flag's combat? And the answer is yes, it's a remake. It should be trying to be a better game than the one it's a remake of. In many ways, this is the major problem Assassin's Creed Black Flag Resynced has, and it's what I want to dedicate most of my time to talking about, and that's the fact that it's such an undefinitive remake. You're probably wondering what I mean by that seemingly harsh stringing together of words. Well, Black Flag itself isn't actually the point of comparison. I don't feel as if I'm playing Black Flag but enhanced. I feel as if I'm playing Black Flag albeit packaged in a modern Ubisoft game. Which is to say, this is Black Flag but worse. If you compare it to Valhalla, Mirage, Shadows, it feels like a step up. But that shouldn't be the targeted improvement of a remake. In a way, by the virtue of recency, it should be better than those games, sure. But it also needs to, in my mind, compete with what it's trying to replace, otherwise what's the point? With Resynced, it's clear Ubisoft aren't trying to depose the original Black Flag, otherwise they would have included the original modern day. Instead, we've got a Dark Animus, whatever a Dark Animus is. It's a series of simulations that toy around with some cool ideas, but they don't interface with anything aside from data files. Where we get to read about this game's take on the modern day being set in 2096, but at no point do we actually get to see nor interact with it. Instead, we have Ego, some Templar AI trying to lobotomize us to turn us into a drone for some reason. I guess the Animus has become some ubiquitous technology in this futuristic setting. And the general idea is we've got to resist Ego by joining with her rebellious bird son. It's very much the rudderless nonsense you would expect from more recent Assassin's Creed titles. Resynked's continuity therefore occurs after Shadows, meaning if you were masochistic enough to want a full picture of the Assassin's Creed timeline, you would need to play Black Flag twice. So instead of just being Black Flag's hardly anything to write home about modern day, but again, we're exposed to the cool idea of this overarching back and forth of Ego and the guide exploring these what-if scenarios regarding the life of Edward Kenway and some of his associates. But that idea isn't elaborated in any meaningful way either. Basically, we removed one kind of rubbish modern day and replaced it with a worse one. Just so it could be more tucked out of the way, so the game was more approachable to people who don't have the patience for the game's modern day to begin with, and as a result, Black Flag Resynced occurs separately in the continuity to Black Flag, and Ubisoft have generated all of the argument power they need to say that Black Flag Resynced isn't a replacement of the original game. Therefore, it doesn't need to hold itself to the standards of the 2013 title, but it is a remake of that game. If we aren't looking to surpass that bar, what are we actually doing? Unfortunately, my biggest takeaway has been the disparity in writing quality between Ubisoft in 2013 with Assassin's Creed 4 and Ubisoft now. They decided to add stuff throughout the story and include entire new plot lines, including an epilogue of nonsense. On multiple levels, it is painfully apparent what the new stuff is. The original cutscenes stand out against Assassin's Creed Shadows, Mirage, Valhalla, where the vast majority of dialogue was transactional, completed with vague animations to sort of allude to interaction but has nowhere near the heart. Black Flag was exceptional for convincing you of the authenticity of its character interactions, and that's true here as well. These cutscenes are not just head and shoulders above the quality of the vast majority of what you saw in those games, they are also considerably superior to the average cutscene you would witness in the new content in Resynced. Well, we're using that same unnatural voice acting cadence that Ubisoft seemed to have perfected for some reason. Dialogue a 5-year-old could have trounced, and those same Assassin's Creed RPG gestures, you know, the ones that remind you that Cassandra is in a cave somewhere, they exist in total contrast to the heartfelt art of the original story. They don't look anywhere near as natural, they don't add anywhere near as much, and they aren't even written well. They're not even good ideas sometimes. Worse yet, they often have to rip Edward entirely out of character, which dilutes the focused experience of Black Flag. As for the Darby McDevitt writing, it's negligible. I'm going to absolve him of the vast majority of problems that plague the new content, because his new stuff is fine. It's about 3 scenes, and it really doesn't add anything that original Black Flag was lacking, but it also wouldn't look out of place in that game. Obviously, Black Flag was his writing to begin with. I can understand why he'd want to write a few scenes for this, because they're going to remake the game with or without him. But they touted him like he was a selling point, when in reality the vast majority of the new content was written by whomever. So let's have a nosy at a few examples of what the new writing, if you can even call it that, is like. We'll start with the stuff that doesn't necessarily interfere with the story already present, and that's our new characters. Our shipwright, Lucy Baldwin, and our man-at-arms, the Padre. We recruit these characters because apparently we need them aboard the Jackdaw now. We didn't in the original game, but now suddenly we do. Each officer gets a unique recruitment quest line, complete with all those vague body language cutscenes you'd expect from Assassin's Creed Odyssey and Valhalla, and of course, dreadful dialogue.
You did keep me from hanging.
True.
But that doesn't mean you own me.
Also true.
These sorts of inclusions make Black Flag Resynced feel a bit like a fever dream. In Lucy Baldwin's quest, Edward needs a shipwright for some meta reason, a gameplay benefit locked behind helping her, and in order to secure that, Edward Kenway is willing to help her get revenge on her father for murdering her wealthy grandfather and cutting her out of the inheritance. For context, Edward is in the West Indies to secure a good life. He wants to be rich. He is obsessed with that mission. It is a driving force for his self-destructive path that results in the deaths of many of his allies and the total alienation of those who don't die. It is very important to preserve the integrity of that narrative, that if you're introducing new characters, they conform to that vicious cycle. How Edward behaves needs to conform to that same cycle in accordance with where we're up to in the story. So, do either of those things happen? Not really. Early game Edward out of nowhere decides to be a stand-up, empathetic guy, undermining the completeness of his selfish, wealth-driven character. Sure, Baldwin promises to cut Edward in, and Edward does get a shipwright out of it, which he needs for some reason. But his priorities are notably shifted. He seems more invested in the person. This is a jarring length of time to dedicate to some random individual when Edward wouldn't do this for Adewale, whom these new friends' primary purpose appears to undermine. The Padre very much has the same problem. Edward needs a master-at-arms and decides to recruit a Portuguese monk, who as it turns out was a former pirate. Edward immediately tries to recruit the monk back into the life of piracy, but he's not a world-wise man. He would not outright believe that a priest and a fearsome master-at-arms could coexist in the same individual. So immediately, if hypothetically Edward needed more friends aboard his ship, he'd already be looking elsewhere. The Padre is reluctant to return to a life of piracy now that he's a reformed man of God, but even though his trip here appears wasted, he ends up helping the Padre out with an errand. Edward just wouldn't do that. He wouldn't, at this point in his journey, see the value in doing that. He sees the life of an errand boy, of a servant beneath him, because he wants a better life, so he simply wouldn't go running errands. Particularly not when there's nothing in it for him. Never mind on behalf of a man he should be entirely blind to the value of. But it gets worse. The Padre then sends us on a fetch quest to investigate Ducas's men. At this point, Ducas is dead, but he wants to know what Ducas's men have planned. So we must travel over 4,000 meters west to do one thing and then discover we have to travel all the way back, because Ducas's men have already launched to attack the village. For starters, this is utterly terrible open world mission design because it has no respect for the fact that travelling across an open world takes time, and as such it incentivizes fast travel. But guess which location's fast travel point is deactivated for this objective? That can only mean one thing, by the way, and that's that Ubisoft know this is bad. Why would you consciously make the experience of playing your game more painful? Anyway, once we return to the Padre, his village has been sacked. Many of the villagers are now dead, and as luck would have it, the Padre is willing to return to his life of piracy, provided we grant him the opportunity at some biblical vengeance. He doesn't even change out of his monk's habit, he just boards ships and fights in it. From this point, outside of their own quest chains, these officers, Lucy Baldwin and the Padre, will just be visible standing on the deck of the Jackdaw, saying nothing for the vast majority of the game. A story that spans years, they just stand in silence. They could, in theory, interact with the story to an extent, but they don't really. But the story definitely cannot interact with them, because the vast majority of it was written and performed in 2013 and they didn't exist in it. So the story naturally continues as if they don't. There is nothing to them that makes this not obvious, sadly. They're both poor, uninspiring characters that exist to service minor gameplay perks, who arguably contribute nothing to the story other than to distract you from it. And the greatest casualty is the significance of Adewale. This is a plot of unrecognised loss for Edward, how his selfish pursuit of riches and reputation has led to destruction everywhere he goes. This results in the demise of Stede Bonnet, in the death of Blackbeard, in the betrayal of Ben Hornigold, the execution of Jack Rackham, the insanity of Charles Vane, the death of Mary Read, and of course the turning point, the ultimate alienation of Adewale. When Adewale refuses to return to the Jackdaw, when the diligent, enduring quartermaster walks away, you want to leave with him. It doesn't hit anywhere near as hard when you've got the Padre and Lucy Baldwin hanging around, or, come to think of it, Albert the Monkey. And then there's Bernard. For some reason, Ubisoft Singapore thought the Great Anagua hideout needed a butler. But not just any butler, an assassin butler. Yeah, this guy he's just randomly an assassin. Specifically, he's a retired assassin who fell in love with the former lady of this manor, who passed away before the Templar Julian Ducasse occupied it. And Bernard here was just milling about? Like, sure, I get retirement, but maybe don't go mopping a Templar's floors. He wants us to restore the house by gathering his lady's paintings and furnishing the place. So of course I put a cut chair facing the bed. What do you take me for? I'm not a monster. Anyway, considering we killed the Templar and are now furnishing his house, Bernard doesn't adopt his fellow assassin's dim view of Edward. The remake has a weird tendency to throw characters into this game that just get along with him, which is fine, but nothing then shakes that tree. Bernard is undermining the assassins, who view him as selfish, misguided, and arrogant. A man with potential, mentally incapable of doing good for the sake of goodness. Atabai's scorn for him is not just well-founded, it's acknowledgement of the fact that Edward is dangerous. He's smashing his way through an ancient conflict in pursuit of personal gain. Before he even truly knew what the Brotherhood was, many assassins were dead because of him, and that was all on account of his intentions, his desire for wealth. The assassins make a point of the fact that his intentions matter, with Mary Read serving as his lifeline, the one that believes deep down Edward is capable of doing good. Having an assassin, even a retired one, serving as Edward's butler, eternally grateful that his lady's former house is no longer in the palm of a tyrannical Templar's hand, and is instead serving as the home base of a particularly reckless, self-destructive pirate, feeding Edward wisdom from a place of encouragement, in some way just lessens the process of earning the assassin's approval. His affability makes Atabai seem like the problem and not Edward himself. It steals significance from Mary Read, and it's not entirely Bernard's fault. Edward is meeting him halfway. His character is making personality concessions to seem more agreeable, more reasonable, more level-headed. Things that pirate Edward Kenway just isn't. It's why his path is so destructive even. Every loss and setback sends him spiralling further and further out of control. His decisions are informed by a fatal cocktail of hubris and desperation. And this builds up and gets worse and worse as he circles his obsession, culminating in a realization that his path has wrought nothing but destruction. At the point where Edward realizes he doesn't truly want this, he is meant to be more or less at rock bottom. But now, in the conversation where that's explored, he just isn't. He has Lucy Baldwin, he has the Padre, he has Bernard, and his Jackdaw pet crewmate. The much anticipated character shift just has a fraction of the impact because the new content more often than not functions as a hand grenade to the game's focus. It all seems to be added on a misunderstanding that it has more room than it does, but the backbone of Edward's journey is inflexible. I get that the new characters are meant to add a bit of life and satisfaction to taking to the seas aboard the Jackdaw, but is it really meant to feel so homely? I get the appeal of transforming Great Anagua into a home, but is it actually meant to be one? Or was it rather artistically meant to be a soulless testament to Edward Kenway's obsession? A functional hideout away from Nassau to embed that this is a lonely path, I see the appeal in transforming it into a thriving community, but I don't think Edward would care for that. This is not his life. He doesn't view this as his life. His life is back in Bristol with Caroline. It is not digging into Plantain while listening to Lucy Baldwin's sob-story. It is not granting refuge to the Padres village, and it most certainly isn't going on a Caribbean-wide collectathon for paintings to soothe Bernard's soul. They find a means to loosely motivate Edward, but it's all downhill from there. It would be one thing if this character misunderstanding would be kept to the side content. Sadly, however, it isn't. And it isn't just Edward who suffers for it. In Resynced, Edward has a newfound tendency to never shut up. He will run commentary on everything, even when it doesn't really fit him. When I reached the first island after stealing the jackdaw, it was truly incessant.
Animals have been in the fish. Paw prints. Smaller than a jaguar's. Something mauled these men. Almost too easy. Nice. The ocelots have built their own nest there. Good. I'll need more of this. Pretty good. That's enough to fashion a holster. The crew have their provisions, and I have my holster.
Just shut up. I truly do not understand the need to have Edward run constant commentary on what we're doing like we've forgotten already. It dilutes his already present natural lines in a soup of dialogue that could only exist if Edward was somehow aware that he's a video game character. I understand getting a return on your investment bringing Matt Ryan back, but what is the value in reiterating objectives every 5 seconds, stating the obvious, or otherwise commenting on how well we're playing the game? That's the type of thing you need only if your target audience are 5-year-olds. Since that isn't the case, at least not yet, there is no need for Edward to be making a constant barrage of noise. Being a chatterbox does not make him more interesting as a character. In fact, Edward didn't need making more interesting as a character at all. He was already a fascinating study. If anything, it achieves the opposite effect. Because after a bit, you'll start tuning out when you hear Edward's voice, switching off and not taking on board anything he has to say, whether it be in a cutscene or in gameplay. The dialogue has been diluted in unnecessary waffle. Yes, I know there's treasure here, I'm looking for it. You do not need to constantly feed me the same line that this place looks familiar. It doesn't aid the experience or the immersion to be complimented by Edward every time we make a kill. And the combat quips routinely make me throw up in my mouth. There is no need. Nothing of value is being communicated. The only thing we're accomplishing is disrupting the rhythm of the original game's great dialogue. And of course, miscommunicating Edward's character and turning him from this rugged, self-serving scoundrel into some friendly man of the people for some reason. But hey, I've already spoken a bit about that bit. Anyway, like I said, it's not just Edward who gets misunderstood. Ubisoft also made the genius decision of expanding upon some of the characters already present in Black Flag. After seeing how the new characters have been thrown haphazardly into the plot, and if not the plot's orbit, I had limited optimism the new quest lines for Stede Bonnet and Blackbeard would be any good. Well, to my surprise, the Stede Bonnet quest is reasonably inoffensive. We get a letter from Stede telling us he's imprisoned but he'll be freed soon and to meet him on some isle. We find his schooner wrecked and run aground, and true to his letter's warning, his crew has broken off into factions and are now battling it out on this isle for the treasure. So we align ourselves with the Stede Bonnet loyalists. What? Put the mutineers to the sword, who despite being stranded on this isle have already changed their clothes to be easily identified. Then the British Empire shows up, so we kill them. After which point we have the key to the ship's lower deck and Stede's loyalists allow us to explore his cabin. I get what it's trying to be, a nice funeral service for Stede Bonnet, as later on we discover that he's been executed. He's an endearing character portrayed as being out of his depth, nevertheless excited by the prospect of adventure in the life of a pirate. Effectively, it was Edward who set him on this path towards his own demise, dying for a lifestyle that wasn't for him, symbolically represented by his eye patch that serves no function as both of his eyes work. A wealthy merchant who didn't have the slightest bit of need for this lifestyle encouraged onto it and to his death by Edward. When in prison, we learn the details of his undignified execution, how he sobbed and begged. Edward's manipulation sealed his fate. It didn't take much convincing, but it's enough. What I don't like about this quest is that it tries to give Edward closure before he's earned it. I respect that it provides more historical information. That's cool. We also discover he got his sugar back, which is meant to be an endearing fist pump moment. However, once we read his letter, we discover that he's already been executed by the time we're reading it. So I'm not entirely sure how cathartic that's meant to be. His Force Ghost gives us a wave, and we have a portrait to pop up on the wall in the basement of the Great Inagua hideout. The problem here for the story, of course, is Edward grieves Bonnet, rather than bottling it up for that massive blowout. Acknowledging his responsibility in Bonnet's demise now undermines the significance of that realization later. This is fanfiction level stuff, but oh boy is it about to get worse. The new Blackbeard questline is quite possibly the absolute worst the game gets. Blackbeard is one of the best, most interesting characters in Black Flag. He's obviously a notorious pirate rooted in history, and that makes him fascinating by default, and a greatly theatrical character who knew how to command through fear. Blackbeard is the closest thing you're going to get to Pirate Jesus. And he's portrayed as an ally, even a friend of Edward Kenway's. Their relationship is founded on mutual respect. However, Edward's obsession is a step too far even for Blackbeard. Anyway, if you'll recall, Blackbeard is killed in a surprise attack, and his abrupt, shocking demise is the ultimate brutal symbol of just how destructive the pirate's path is. Out of nowhere, this absolute monolith of an individual is cut down, and it shocks Edward to the core. Anyway, in the original game, that's kind of where Blackbeard is left. His passing is acknowledged as we sail away from the battle, and then Kenway, in his desperation to reach his prize, is spiraling and aligning himself with less ideal allies such as Charles Vane. It is a reasonably unceremonious death, and it's intended to be one. Do you think they left that well enough alone? Of course they didn't. Now there's an in-between bit, and I'm just going to have to show you this, because nothing I could come up with saying will quite encapsulate it.
We recovered this.
We lost Edward Thatch this night. But Blackbeard yet lives. He lives in the nightmares of governors. He lives in the fearful tales told by officers, and he lives in the heart of every pirate who wants only to be free. He will not be forgotten. Not now. Not ever.
Before I unpackage anything about the scene, I have one question. Why is Ezio's family playing? Don't get me wrong, I love an Ezio's family variant myself, but what does that have to do with Blackbeard? Next, this scene is total nonsense. Adewale inexplicably risked his neck to recover Blackbeard's hat from the battle, which presumably would have still been aboard the man of war Blackbeard fell on. So why did Ade do something so stupid and reckless that seems out of character for him? Furthermore, like I said before, this is not the moment where Edward acknowledges his grief. His uniting the pirates under the memory of Edward Thatch speech is just unbearably painfully out of place. If Edward at this point in the story had the capacity to do that, he wouldn't align with Charles Vane in the first place. Worse yet, it's only a rolling series of vague platitudes. The writing here isn't just terrible, it's non-existent. Adewale inexplicably recovered Thatch's hat, and now Edward is giving a speech that can be summarized with the word stuff. I understand that lingering on Blackbeard seems like a nice idea, perhaps an opportunity for some sentiment. But you have to actually make a sentiment! Also, this is storytelling. It needs to be to a higher standard than posting a picture of your departed granddad on Facebook and saying gone but not forgotten. But that's all that is, and we're not even done yet. The next scene is nicely shot, I'll give it credit where it's due, and Edward is sat on the beach drinking and pondering over Blackbeard's hat. And then Blackbeard's Force Ghost appears, standing over him while he finds a treasure map hidden within the hat vaguely goading Edward about his foolish pursuit of riches, and then it becomes side content. We can choose to move on with the story here, and preserve whatever dignity the next scene has left, or, hear me out, we can pursue Blackbeard's treasure. Finding Blackbeard's treasure is reasonably straightforward. It's in one of the smugglers' hideouts where we have to blow up a couple of walls and kill Mr. Hands, the second in command of the Queen Anne's Revenge. Upon discovering the treasure, we learn that it's only farming tools, and a letter from the man himself. Again, the only way out is through. You're just going to have to hear this for yourselves.
Whoever's reading this letter, you best hope I'm dead, or you'll answer for disturbing what I took uncommon pains to secure. If, in point of fact, I am dead, with luck, it's Edward Kenway who's doing the reading, having been lured by the smell of gold. That being the case, I'm sorry to disappoint you, lad. You've not found gold. But what you have found is treasure of sorts. Here, you have everything you'll need to establish a freehold and grow it into the grand proposition we always dreamed of. It's cost me a pretty penny, too, if I'm honest, so don't go squandering it. Do right by me in this, Kenway. The world needs a place like Nassau as much as it ever did.
You soft-headed old coot.
Now don't worry, this weren't my whole fortune. The rest is hid safe, and there ain't no map to it. Blackbeard.
Clever bastard. All right, Thatch. I'll see to it.
Before we get into the compounding bollocks, let's talk about Blackbeard's foresight. To paraphrase, the letter basically says, in the event of my surprise death, hopefully Edward Kenway gets a hold of my hat containing a map to this here box of trowels, so that he specifically can build Nassau too. How did Blackbeard formulate this plan so elaborately that things would play out precisely how he wanted? When he died in the heart of a battle he didn't realise until moments prior he was going to be fighting in. That's quite a baffling series of events we've got to expect the player to suspend their disbelief for, especially considering the hat containing the map ended up aboard a British man-of-war and any one of the soldiers could have picked it up. The idea that Adewale successfully retrieved it is insane. Then it just so happened to be the key to uncovering Blackbeard's treasure, which just so happens to be farming tools. It's also a bit weird that Blackbeard would want Edward Kenway to be the one to bring his dream of a freehold for pirates to life. I won't dismiss that Blackbeard cared for that, he did, but Edward Kenway is too preoccupied with his own obsession to truly be able to make Nassau thrive. Blackbeard knows this, he constantly ribs Edward for it. Not because he's necessarily hankering for a character shift, but because he thinks the premise of the observatory is fucking mental. I don't think, therefore, he would necessarily view Edward Kenway as the executor of his will. The two were friends, and like I said, they had mutual respect. A mentor-protege relationship even in the book, but in the game they're portrayed more as peers. Had they explored that more completely in the remake's content, it wouldn't seem as out of sorts as it is. What's happened here is they've latched onto that, not necessarily to explore it, but rather for the sake of a shortcut. Now, Edward is equipped with the tools to turn Great Anagua into a plantation. Would Edward Kenway care to do that at this point in his journey? Probably not. Nevertheless, that's precisely what we end up doing, taking the tools back to Great Anagua, because modern Ubisoft has a fixation on giving us a homely home base. And upon doing that, 2 months pass. Great Anagua now has a thriving farming backbone. The Padres just working the fields for some reason, Lucy Baldwin's absconding in the general direction of somewhere with a bunch of bananas, and the small settlement is now in bloom. And that's the origin story of this flower that Edward Kenway later gives to his daughter at the end of the game. Now, I don't know about you, but I never played original Black Flag and thought, boy, that flower needs an origin story. However, the biggest problem is the tonal whiplash, because we go from that healing journey straight back into spiraling emptiness as we align ourselves with Charles Vane.
So Thatcher's been topped. Fuck's sake.
How am I supposed to take this seriously now that it's been defocused? This is meant to be experienced immediately after Thatcher's death. Edward, to an extent, is still in shock. But now we've done a treasure hunt in Thatcher's name. We've built a community in Thatcher's name. A thriving plantation set up over the course of 2 months. Edward's now processed that grief, and now this scene comes along to unprocess it. We're meant to start believing Edward's pool of optimal allies is dwindling. That the volatility of Charles Vane and Jack Rackham is a gamble, born out of laser focus on his end goal. A miscalculation that backfires and only makes matters worse. It's now reframed from Edward's pursuit being increasingly irrational to Edward just being an idiot because he's had 2 months to consider his next step.
You goddamn fucking knave!
Ubisoft. Perhaps I'm being somewhat too harsh. I don't think most of the new content is any good, but if it's even mediocre, just pointless additions that don't harm nor add anything, it is hard to look past the poor presentation. Often it boils down to there being ideas at play that aren't innately terrible. Not always, but often. However, they are just ideas. They are neither accommodated nor explored. The Blackbeard quest is a key example of that, with that speech that basically communicates nothing. Then look at Lucy Baldwin, the Padre, Bernard. These 3 characters do not sit flush with the original game's writing. The story doesn't bend to accommodate them. They don't exist within it, and they mill about and barely exist outside of it. How am I to foster a connection with these characters if there is no character to connect with? And if that character doesn't interface in any way with the broader experience beyond what's immediately relevant to them? Where does Bernard crop up outside of things that aren't relevant to Bernard? Where does Lucy Baldwin or the Padre fit in? How are we to accept them on this journey if they aren't present for it? Aboard the Jackdaw, they could interject with their opinions on the goings-on of the story without the story having to be shifted to accommodate them, but they don't. A regular back and forth between them, Adewale and Edward would surely be a bare minimum. This thought process can be extended to concepts. Where does turning Great Anagua into Nassau 2 fit in? It's hard to fathom any of the new stuff happening because it doesn't coherently intersect with the original material. In fact, the epilogue, as I see it frequently described, is actually a separate ending specific to the new stuff. If you recall, when Thatcher's killed in original Black Flag, he's cut down by a bog-standard British soldier. Now he's killed by a very particular-looking gentleman. At the time, I noticed, but I didn't think too much of it, which is good. Well, as it turns out, this was the historical figure who actually killed Blackbeard. Or at least his crew did. This is Robert Maynard, a Royal Navy lieutenant who was famously never truly rewarded for killing Blackbeard. So it stands to reason in this story he would continue with his vendetta in his pursuit of ambition. Maynard's inclusion is actually something I think Black Flag could have done with to a degree. Now he's set his eyes on Edward, which I think is an interesting idea to play around with. He's clearly done his research, and that grants him genuine menace. But what lets the arc down from jump is, at the point in the story where it becomes available, there's actually no room for it. Its beginning only becomes available after we've completed the main story mission Everything is Permitted at Tulum, where Edward openly acknowledges the errors of his ways, casting away his pursuit of riches, the pirate's life, and beginning his journey to become an assassin. It's quite a condensed portion of the game where Edward goes around tying up loose ends really, dealing with Woodes Rogers, Bartholomew Roberts, L.T. Barone, and of course eventually Torres. After which point, of course, he sets sail for England with his pet Albert the monkey to be a father to his daughter Jenny in wake of Caroline's passing. That gives us, for optimal continuity, an incredibly slim window to fit in the World Without Gold plot. It's a shame that it doesn't align with Edward's newfound purpose. Maynard is no Templar, he's just a zealous officer of the Royal Navy. He killed Blackbeard and now he wants to kill Edward. However, the version of Edward he wants to kill no longer exists in a manner of speaking. So, there's a peculiar disconnect. I think this story definitely needed to occur earlier, even if only by a poignant conversation or two. Also, we're now well and truly in the back end of the game where we should be taking the fight to the Templars and satisfying that Assassin's Creed element. Being put on the back foot by a redcoat with a lax interpretation of uniform regulation is somewhat disruptive to the pacing. Maynard has come all the way out here to drink with us and otherwise lay down the law. He wants us to unconditionally surrender to him in Kingston, although not so secretly he wants us to fight him so he can kill us. I think he'd be a little bit more intimidating if he hadn't just boxed in Great Anagua with a man of war, and instead of confining us there, he just leaves. He has nothing to persuade us to surrender with, other than the promise of a royal pardon. All Maynard has actually accomplished then is reminding Edward that he's present in the West Indies, with Edward deciding it's a good idea to go poking that particular tiger. I mean, we'll be fine. Edward has plot armor. And unfortunately, according to history, so does Maynard. So, we've got the unstoppable force, the immovable object, and theoretically a burning question about where the bloody hell the stakes are going to come from. So we head to Kingston, presumably to find the stakes, although in actuality we're here to preempt Maynard becoming a problem by killing him first, only to discover that he has captured a pirate master gunner, whom Edward decides we should go and recruit. So we go to battle and board HMS Demolition. We don't find Maynard because it would seem he's not here, but we do find the Master Gunner, alive albeit locked in a box. This is our new friend Tobias Smith, or as the crew refer to him, Deadman. Deadman Smith here brings us up to speed on Maynard's plans, and from here Edward devises a scheme to stick it to Maynard and get him off his back once and for all, and to rob him and liberate him of his gold, because we're pirates, remember? Except at this point in the story, Edward is no longer interested in that. So in the new content, the game tries to make Edward more likeable and less self-centered for the entire run. And now that there's actually room to make Edward more likeable and less self-centered, they only want to make him unlikable and self-centered. I would love to know how they've managed to pull that off. The only thing that springs to mind is this was written by somebody else altogether, and the writing for all the new quest lines were way too compartmentalized, because this, according to its placement, neither fits with the story it's slotting into, nor does it fit in remotely with any of the new content added to this remake that makes Edward a more likeable rogue. Ubisoft seem to have an aversion to the idea that a protagonist can be intentionally unlikable, and their gradual growth is what makes them so. If they're trying to make Edward seem a bit less likeable now, the only reason is that a payoff isn't far behind it. But in case it somehow slipped your notice, the payoff is already supposed to be happening. It's Edward turning away from his self-destructive path towards the assassins, and demonstrating at length repeatedly that he's learned and developed. He's no longer the pirate the vast majority of characters from here on out he interacts with knew, garnering respect from friends and foes alike. The destructive force wantonly chasing his own pursuits is now focused on a greater cause. The only reason we would need to build that up and pay that off again in a piece of side content is so that we can somehow factor our new characters. Lucy Baldwin, the Padre, Deadman Smith, who's just as random to me as the other two characters, in a character arc that doesn't otherwise accommodate them. Having that occur now twice only highlights to me how the story didn't have the room for these new characters, because they need their own separate narrative conclusion, instead of being wrapped up under one cohesive ending. And I think in that respect I've identified the straw that broke the camel's back.
With that, I declare the Jackdaw and her crew ready! What say you, Quartermaster?
It's a start. And a good one! So say I!
If you play Resynced immediately after playing original Black Flag, it becomes very apparent there was a fixation on ensuring Anne Bonny got way more screen time. She'll interject in various scenes she otherwise wasn't that present in, and it's not something that bothers me necessarily either way. But what I think Ubisoft Singapore were going for was to legitimize her, because ultimately she succeeds Adewale and becomes Edward Kenway's second quartermaster. Considering where in the narrative that happens, there isn't much time after the fact for her to demonstrate value in that role. Beyond, of course, the conversation with Edward before Edward rushed off to the observatory to kill Torres, where the two discussed the systemic danger the Templars pose, complete with analogies that encapsulate how they commit violence against society without getting any blood directly on their hands. It's a great scene that highlights the importance of the assassins and Edward's understanding of that, and now Deadman Smith is here to clip through Anne. Thanks for that, Ubisoft. Anyway, there's an effort now to make her seem more resourceful and helpful prior to becoming Quartermaster, rather than being a background character until Mary Reed convinced her the pirate life could be for her, and she picked up valuable experience under Rackham. She is now demonstrated to be aware of events. Sometimes she points us in the right direction as a substitution for the tailing missions the original game was too fond of. There's even a conversation between Anne and Adewale, which is what I'd like to call a classic baton handoff. Anne's attitude earns Adewale's approval. These are microscopic occurrences to give Anne Bonny more authority in the plot, which I don't think was entirely necessary. Edward and Anne bond over their shared grief as Edward begins his journey towards becoming an assassin. Anne therefore is the obvious choice for a Quartermaster, because she's not on the journey to joining the Brotherhood like Edward and Adewale are, but she is equipped to understand an assassin's purpose. The original story demonstrated that she was qualified for the role through the stories Edward heard in prison of the infamous Anne Bonny and Mary Reed sticking it to the British Empire on their own. Resynced wanted to show us that a bit more, because the significance of the assassins and the significance of historical tourism have swapped places in the franchise's priority order. The distinction being the pirate aspect is still important to Resynced going forward from this moment, whereas that wasn't the case in the original game. Anne Bonny is stepping into some big shoes there. Adewale was a moral compass for Pirate Edward, but upon realising the damage he's caused and turning to the assassins, he becomes that for himself. Edward gives Anne the role of Quartermaster more because she needs it than he needs a Quartermaster. She needs the distraction from her grief, having just lost her child, and of course contending with that empty feeling that Edward is all too familiar with in wake of the loss of Mary Reed and all the others over the course of this story. Now, since we have Edward relapsing into pirate foolery, it wouldn't work without a Quartermaster moral compass, and that's Anne now. In the world without Goldark, she wastes no time sniffing out Edward's bollocks, serving as a point of friction, pointing out the foolishness in the plan to rob Maynard. And in order to have Anne here to do that, we need Anne as our active Quartermaster, meaning this particular arc can only take place after Edward has returned to Tulum. In order for Anne Bonny to occupy a character role she didn't need to fill, we need to regress Edward's own development, all for the sake of a back and forth with a man who faded into obscurity after killing Blackbeard, just so we can justify the inclusion of Deadman Smith, a character who for some reason is convinced that he's dying, but he never elaborates how he knows this, and seems to spend most of his time fixating on his impending doom, with whom we share unnatural interactions due to Ubisoft's modern writing problem. All of this exists in the service of a slight gameplay benefit obtained through having yet another half-character present on our ship. The problem with this arc runs so much deeper than just less than ideal timing. It would be way more coherent if we didn't need Quartermaster Anne Bonny aboard the Jackdaw, as the broad strokes of what Edward is doing would make so much more sense if these events occurred prior to him returning to Tulum, rebelling against the idea that his pursuit of gold is reckless and dangerous, and ultimately sobering up to his realization and putting it into practice. The idea of Maynard as a side villain is also fine, even good. Edward might very well seek retribution for Thatcher's death, which would be a more fitting, not to be confused with fitting, motivation for his character at this point in the story, especially since he's now allowing himself to feel that grief, so it could theoretically serve as a placeholder for finding new purpose. But this is also serving as an ending dedicated to the new additions to our crew, as if they didn't cease being actual characters the moment their respective quests ended. So, no matter how good it could be in isolation in theory, I'm not exactly going to care. Also, if you look at the moment-to-moment structure, it's death by 1,000 Ubisoft side quests. We're orbiting weird dialogue and boring characters, with gameplay that possesses a strange self-awareness that it is in fact boring. There's one moment where Padre has you lug a box of bottles of rum, I assume, up a hill during the party sequence at Great Inagua, and then once you get there as part of the merriment, you just randomly start scrapping your own crew. Not as part of anything that resembles an organised contest, just merely for the hell of it. If we're about to face Maynard's armada, I have a hard time believing that kicking the shit out of your crew is going to make that any easier. Starting a battle with a broken eye socket doesn't give you an advantage. This is counterproductive and exists purely so that the player doesn't get bored. Lugging around boxes is pretty boring in fairness, but the problem's its inclusion, not what you do next to make things more fun. A lot of the other new stuff does a very similar thing with regards to Ubisoft's discomfort around gameplay that isn't exactly the most entertaining. The Lucy Baldwin quest has a hilarious example, where she and Edward are talking while they're walking from the docks to the Great Inagua hideout, which isn't a particularly long walk, where, once Lucy has run out of things to say, she remarks that Edward is a good climber and then challenges us to a race the remainder of the way to the manor's patio. As you can imagine, it requires no climbing, it's a socially awkward segue, and Edward sprinting is miles faster than Lucy. It's clear the only reason Ubisoft have done this is so that we get there faster, so it isn't something unique to the World Without Gold questline. However, the Great Inagua party sequence in particular is a total bugger for it. Lucy Baldwin once again has us enter into her shooting contest, so we can shoot the dummies she set up that she just had lying around somewhere, while she dumps exposition on us about Maynard and Deadman Smith. Being fed vast quantities of background information is mundane, I get it, but this doesn't make that any better. It just makes your story look impatient with itself. As perhaps the most scathing criticism I could give this quest in particular, why wouldn't it be? We're bouncing across the map and watching Edward repeatedly fall into the exact same trap. Maynard lures Edward somewhere with his gold, and sure enough, his gold isn't there. Instead, we're ambushed. I can understand how a gold-obsessed Edward might fall for that once, maybe. But then the dickhead goes and does it again. He endangers the lives of his crew after having just acknowledged that not a man or woman that he loves is still standing beside him due to the path he's taken, and then throws himself at obvious traps in the pursuit of the thing that he recognizes to have cost him so much: greed. His character isn't the only thing being regressed here. It appears his brain is being regressed with it. All of it is done to facilitate a moment where Edward has Maynard in his sights, but his friends are in peril, forcing him to choose between Maynard and his gold, and the Padre, Lucy Baldwin, and Deadman Smith. Of course, sobering up to the theoretical value of the friends we made along the way, Edward chooses his allies. But when you consider these characters have the collective writing quality of a particularly crude scribble, if I were Edward, I would have taken the gold. That is quite possibly the last thing you want me to be thinking in that moment. So to summarise, this quest just becomes Edward's character development, but again and far less natural. Maynard got away because he doesn't die for another 3 decades or so. And Lucy Baldwin, the Padre, and Deadman Smith are no more interesting than they already weren't. To top it all off in spectacular fashion, Blackbeard's Force Ghost shows up to re-explain everything. Stop doing this, please! Look, I get that they are trying to small-scale replicate one of the last scenes in Black Flag, where Edward looks out and sees all of his departed friends gathered at a table on Great Inagua, and Charles Vane and Jack Rackham for some reason. But that is a symbolic representation of his bittersweet adventure out here. He returns to England wealthy and with newfound purpose. He's realising he succeeded in his goal, and that success came long before he realised the cost wasn't worth it. And now he's returning to England alone with a stranger, his daughter whom he's never met, to embark on a new chapter in his life, having weathered the loss of things and people he didn't know to value when they were here. Having Blackbeard just show up as a Force Ghost to spell out the moral of the story doesn't represent anything, it's an in case you didn't get it moment.
Leave off thinking so much on tomorrow that you forget about today. Could be as your last day.
Such an apt narrative theme that I didn't gather at all from the quest I'd just experienced for a man who gets murdered in give or take 13 years.
Well, you see, Captain Kenway, you never know when you might be brutally murdered on the 3rd of December 1735, aged 42 years.
You can't just vomit out Blackbeard at the end of some bullshit and call it closure. It just doesn't work like that. It also undercuts a key aspect to Black Flag's story. When a character dies, we are meant to feel their absence. Having them show up to give us as much as a wave, outside of this one key moment where Edward allows himself to feel their memory, only cheapens, however slightly, those losses. We're meant to feel as if their losses are real, they're gone forever. That realization is the bleak feeling we're meant to arrive at this conversation with Anne with. Blackbeard goes down in a blaze of glory befitting of his legendary infamy. His final words in this life being, "In a world without gold, we might have been heroes." It is an unimaginably tough way to go. But once the occasion is over and done with and the dust settles, we're meant to be left with that cold, empty feeling because, as epic as that was, it's curtains for Edward Thatch. But not anymore, because now he's been taking lessons apparently from none other than Qui-Gon Jinn. What they've done is taken a symbolic moment that shows Edward is processing his losses rather than running headfirst into his next plan, and assumed this is just how Edward more generally processes his grief, which leads us into how the new content handles Edward altogether. Simply put, they scattershot a general outline of Edward's vague character into situations, and that is why every single time it doesn't feel natural. None of the new content sits well in the chronology, because Edward's always in developmental limbo so that you can do it out of order. Possessing some of the traits of the scoundrel that he is for the vast majority of the game, and the good man he's on the journey to become later, he cannot engage with anything beyond superficially because his story was elaborated in 2013, so it's absurdly obvious what is the original content, and what they've glued on with the dregs of a Pritt stick. Even if you tidied up the presentation with some actual mocap and remembered how characters are actually meant to sound when they talk, it would still be apparent to me what's been lobbed haphazardly in 13 years later. The modern Ubisoft game is a layered problem at the best of times, but at its core, it's just written badly. That corporate nothing is sacred in the dogged pursuit of the bottom line attitude screams louder than any new line of dialogue. The new arcs have to stand on their own 2 feet, so it's obvious there. It's worn on the sleeves of plot lines that play like what they are. Deliverables. No conversation with Bernard, the assassin butler, can convince me the motivation behind his implementation has the slightest thing to do with any creative vision. Much like the Blackbeard Force Ghost moments are playing on the idea of an applause moment, because fan service, good or bad, has a tendency to lead to knee-jerk reactions that ultimately result in more copies sold. I refuse to believe these inclusions are here because somebody in a creative position desperately wanted them. To me, it's more likely the idea of new content was imposed. It's a simple business strategy. Appeal to FOMO. Regard for what it's interfacing with is entirely secondary to ensuring that it's there as a selling point. To facilitate these inclusions, Black Flag is in no way treated with the respect it's due. You could even be forgiven for calling these nonsense tangents insulting. This unceremonious assassination of the experience is most apparent in these new arcs and new stories, but it also crops up as micro-fractures within the already existing story. I'm not about to drop anything mind-boggling, but please, bear with me, you'll see what I mean, I hope. If you'll recall, a vast quantity of Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag's missions were irksome tailing missions. I personally don't mind a tailing mission every so often. I most certainly like them more in old Assassin's Creed games when I play them, but to say that Black Flag had too many would be an understatement. Resynced tries to fix that problem by not having so many tailing missions. I get it and even respect it in principle, but it isn't quite as simple as cutting out the follow. As annoying as following oddly paranoid people around is, A lot can but not always be picked up over the course of the tale. Sometimes skipping that means that information now has to be delivered in another, more recent Ubisoft way, if they even bother to do it at all. You're not always given a choice as to whether or not you can do a tailing mission as it was. Sometimes you're forced to skip them. Other times, you can kill your tailed target and loot their body to conveniently find a letter documenting precisely the information you need. The fortune of that aside, you can easily dismiss this written material with a slip of the thumb onto B. How the information gets delivered is sidelined for a flimsy contingency to ensure that it is, and your quest log gets updated before you stare at the same objective for too long. If you like reading, a wall of text might not sound too bad, but this is not a book. That is a less intimate way to convey this information. The game shouldn't not care if I soak in its story. It shouldn't even be geared towards guaranteeing the experience of players who refuse to pay attention. These tailing missions with soft variations in case you failed them are not examples of branching gameplay. They're often just tailing missions that reward the player with quicker, more efficient gameplay if they refuse to engage with what the game's asking of them. In my opinion, that's a symptom of a game that doesn't really care at all for your experience. Tailing missions were heavily criticised in the original, therefore they got slashed. And where they couldn't be, alternatives were put in place. The ones that got cut weren't even cut with adequate regard for aspects of the story that relied on tailing missions to make the most sense. The best example I can give is when we first arrive at Kingston. Edward Kenway bumps into James Kidd, and it turns out they're both here to tail Prinz, albeit for entirely different purposes. Edward's after the Sage, Kidd's after Prinz's life. So Edward tags along and keeps Kidd from killing the target. Long story short, Edward crashes Kidd's mission. A golden opportunity for the assassins gone because Edward is running a scheme. In the original version of events, he is entirely unwelcome up until that moment. Well, you see, now with the tailing mission gone, James Kidd just outright tells us where Prinz and Torres are going to be meeting.
Edward, what the hell are you doing here?
Kid, hold off for God's sake. I'm here for the Sage and I need Prinz alive.
I'm headed for Prin's yard. He's holding an auction. The Sage you care so much about might be there. Follow me.
James Kidd, aka Mary Read, just wouldn't trust Edward with that information. That's why it's important that he tags along with the tale, and both characters learn at the same time. It preserves the scuffing of Kidd's mission being Edward's fault. Without the tailing mission, with Kidd telling us outright where to go, it is at least partially Kidd's fault too.
I've been stalking that pig for a week now, charting his moves, and here I find not one but two of my targets, and you rob me of both.
Patience, man.
Technically, Squeezer, you robbed yourself of them kills. You didn't have to tell the known destructive quantity where Prinz and Torres were going to meet. Edward's selfish recklessness is well observed by this point in the story, by Kidd in particular. The idea that Kidd would let us tag along on such a sensitive mission makes Kidd look like an idiot. At least in the original version, Kidd didn't have the room for a choice. Now, I'm not going to sit here and call this an egregious offence. It's not, it's minor, but it is one of those micro fractures I was talking about. This ham-fisted addition of mission design improvements disrupts the logic of the moment-to-moment storytelling. It may result in cheap, negligible errors, but when they crop up where the original game didn't have them, it isn't entirely ideal. Could you argue these adjustments make the sacrifice of that slight cohesion worth it? Maybe. I suppose that ultimately boils down to preference. If you didn't mind tailing missions, you'll probably find it to be an unnecessary change. But if, like the vast majority, you didn't like them, I suppose it's worthwhile, but what it's replaced with isn't exactly inspiring gameplay either. Rather than following Torres and Prinz, we just head to the cemetery where they're meeting, and then listen in on the conversation. They now politely wait until they reach the cemetery to begin, avoiding detection by darting bush to bush. It's basically still a tailing mission, but minus the hard bit. In hindsight, I would love to know what happens if you're detected, but I didn't try it, and replaying memories just isn't a thing. This is quite typical of the rework in the mission structure. there are still plenty of tailing missions, they're just more static. Sometimes an alternative path is available, but that typically results in dispatching your tail right away, and just reading the convenient letter on their corpse. And other times we don't get a say in whether or not we actually want to do the tail as it was in the original game, and we're forced into something that is equally disengaging. Other times instead of a tail, we'll find ourselves doing an investigation. You know, where we go into a room and hold the button Y while looking at things. I don't mean to imply that deploying basic interaction as an investigation method is somehow bad, but it's maybe about as good as what was already there. What do these shortcuts improve? Where the tailing missions have been removed altogether, the pacing has been altered. You end up at times with entirely new dialogue that doesn't sit flush with the rest of the experience. Or you just get more options to completing one objective within a linear mission structure, which means any branching has to form up immediately, defeating the purpose of the branching. I don't mind so much that the tailing missions themselves have been cut back so considerably, and they're still present during events where it wouldn't make sense for anything else to happen. I just think if you're going to cut out something for being bland, replacing it with something equally bland, as is typically the case here, isn't an improvement. It's merely an adjustment, and it's got more to do with how IGN might view it versus the average player. There are other changes to story moments and missions that baffle me somewhat. For instance, after Edward's ruse is uncovered and he's taken prisoner aboard a ship where he meets Adewale. In the process of escaping and retrieving his weapons, he finds leather pieces that he decides to incorporate as armor to his robes. In the original game, we get a scene where he puts it on. It's been removed for some reason, but why? Then there's the diving bell bit. Blackbeard wants to dive on shipwrecks for medicine. In original Black Flag, that meant we had to purchase a diving bell. We can still do that, to be fair. But now there's an optional alternative pathway to acquiring the thing. No, I don't know why this guy's trying to punch the main characters.
A diving bell would cost a pretty penny. Ade might know another way.
Yeah, but would he? These things weren't exactly common in the 18th century. I get what they're trying to do with this. Having to buy the diving bell is a pain in the backside. So giving the player an alternate means to acquire one isn't a bad idea. But it is a diving bell, an uncommon piece of specialized technology that you could probably count on one hand how many were in the West Indies at this point in history, if indeed any were. Adewale just happening to know where to find one feels a bit random. It isn't all that important, but should we choose to go through with that just to see where it goes, it exposes us to yet more unnatural dialogue and janky, mal-presented cutscenes. And I don't think we should check in with Adewale on the off chance he knows of a camp of freebooters who recently acquired this rare diving bell, and are situated nearby no less. To bypass spending money on getting one in a game where money is easy to come by is really worth injecting an inferior deviation for. Especially when going out of your way to get this diving bell this way doesn't take any time. It is maybe an extra 2 minutes of game that saves you 5,000 reals. If one of the options is spending in-game money, the other option is spending in-game time, surely. This is way too insignificant an option for that to apply. The choice is between spending money and not spending money. If we're committed to the whole maybe Adewale knows something unlikely that might help us idea, instead of him telling us about freebooters on Nassau that just so happened to come into possession of a diving bell that they no longer need because they took the royal pardon, as if they had any need for a diving bell prior to that, why isn't he feeding us a rumour he hypothetically heard about a salvage expedition that we then have to track down? So we can acquire the diving bell in a situation where a diving bell being present actually makes sense, and the process of getting a hold of it has some challenge to it, and takes a bit more time than 2 minutes. This way we'd get to weigh up whether or not 5,000 reals is worth it to save ourselves the hassle. As things stand, the choice is too easy to not do this. It's basically an idiot tax. With that, I think I've encapsulated the problem with the vast majority of the new written material in Black Flag Resynced. It's just kind of bad, and where it's not bad, it's not exactly implemented with scalpel precision. There's a lot that's been thrown in here that shears apart the game's focus, and that doesn't just apply to the new writing. New features also serve to blow that up. Having a pet monkey aboard your ship is really cool. I love Albert. However, I'm not entirely convinced Albert is going to love England. I can't pay attention to what Edward and Jenny are saying because I'm just worried about how this little guy is going to cope with the weather. Having the monkey pet present in the credits as Edward and Jenny sail home to England doesn't ruin the scene, but it throws in an imprecise potential addition. Whatever emotion I'm meant to be feeling could be overruled by the fact this monkey is here, and that's kind of fun. In fact, Lucy Baldwin and the Padre are here! Deadman Smith is here! Why? See what I mean? I only just noticed that. This credit scene wasn't intended to be funny, necessarily. However, it kind of is now. They obviously aren't intended to be present for that scene, but based on how the game works, they just kind of are. It's kind of like mid-cutscene Deadman Smith in his neutral position, clipping through Anne. If this adds up enough, and believe me when I say it does, the additions don't look tailored to the experience that it's building on, and the humorous results can overrule the emotion you're meant to be feeling. And with that, I sum up what it is I don't like about Black Flag Resynced. I know it sounds like I must hate the game, but I actually don't. I merely have a strong dislike for prominent aspects of it. If you're after the Black Flag experience, it's still in here, and generally speaking, I really enjoyed replaying that. The remake's visuals are gorgeous, the Caribbean atmosphere is still present, Black Flag's story is so robust, Ubisoft couldn't mess it up enough if they tried. But there has been an attempt. That's all. If anything, I'm grateful for Resynced. It is a case study. The great writing of a 2013 game placed side by side with the dismal slop fest you would expect from Ubisoft in 2026. In this mixture, it is perfectly clear the standards that Ubisoft aren't meeting and how formulaic and meaningless their games have become. This is a game with a foot in both camps. It's partially Black Flag, which gives it a really high ceiling. In fact, to its credit, I'd say it's mostly that. That's why people are enjoying it. That's why it's so successful. But should we cast aside that this game is prettier, you still have that inexplicable risk-averse Ubi slop. There are entire new chapters of writing that don't say anything and dance around non-messages while having us engage in boring activities. Worse yet, the writing is just bad. I couldn't care less about Lucy Baldwin, the Padre, Deadman Smith, Bernard. Beyond Darby McDevitt's implementations, none of the new writing in this game would hold a candle to any of the stuff from 2013. They're not coherent, they communicate nothing, they serve as noise between one bout of gameplay and the next. It's jarring side by side with the original story. What Ubisoft have managed to accomplish is the demonstration that they are not capable of making Black Flag. They're just about competent at remaking it, but their totally modern experiences don't compare in the slightest. It's not down to a lack of skill, it's down to a lack of harmony. Look at Ubisoft's share prices going down the toilet for the past 5 years. Morale's gotta be low for anyone who doesn't know if they'll have a job on Monday. If nothing else, these past few years have demonstrated that how Ubisoft manage themselves and how they make these games, that safe, tried and trusted formula, doesn't work anymore. One robust release that uses a 13-year-old game as a crutch might very well make them some money. But it isn't going to save them, because eventually they're going to have to release something that isn't a remake, where that special something won't be served up on a platter. There are multiple areas where Ubisoft can look to in Black Flag Resynced and see precisely what they need to fix. Presentation is certainly one. The cutscenes of the new stuff are genuinely dreadful. I couldn't tell you how we got here because it's not even the lack of mocap that makes this bad. The delivery of dialogue is poor as well. Whatever direction is being fed to these actors, it needs serious revision. The new writing is also mostly terrible. It makes everything harder to connect with when the writing, this foundation, this spine if you will, is of such a low quality. It carries no purpose and mostly says nothing, and when it does say something, it's something that didn't need saying. More often than not, it also misunderstands Edward. Then there's the inexplicability that's harmful to the original Black Flag experience that's somewhere under here. They need to have a look at the additions that have been made to this game and see how they interface with the original experience underneath. How do these additions counter the core narrative? How does the concept of Lucy Baldwin, the Padre and Deadman Smith exist to undermine Adewale? Having a pet on your ship might be cute, but what is it in service of? They need to look at their insistence on these microtransaction stores and see how it's harmed their reputation and sacrificed goodwill. It exposes the corporate intention behind the product, and while their intentions should in theory be to make money, selling themed gear packs that exist at the expense of the integrity of the product implies the artistic integrity is not so important, so as an art piece it's probably not very good to begin with. There are also easy comparisons for mission design. How does the base content compare to the new stuff? I'd also be grateful if Ubisoft took a look at this compass and realised it's inferior to a minimap in every single way. How the horizontal compass bar has become a staple of gaming is beyond me when a circular compass is superior, but hey, that's worthy of its own rant at some point. At the same time, Resynced being a remake of a genuinely great Assassin's Creed game makes it an opportunity. It's an opportunity to look at what will work, how bespoke, specific, meaningful storytelling with resounding, well-written characters against a backdrop of beautiful scenery and a great atmosphere carries an experience, how direction and focus trumps meandering bloat. The irony of the length of this video is not lost on me. I also think they can take some victories. The combat is better than in the original in my opinion, the stealth is kind of on par, or at least would be if we still had the aid of a minimap, and the parkour is somewhat worse. But there are victories. The naval gameplay has aged well, and no, we won't be addressing the Margaret Thatcher sails. The Caribbean is still a fantastic vibey open world, photo modes are always an easy point, the underwater environments look sharp, so it's a bloody shame you laid those guys off. The general environmental tweaks are also good. Uncharted islands are more interesting now, and the idea of world events in the world, if not the execution, has always been a pretty nifty idea. I'm a sucker for environmental storytelling, so I would say that. The expansion of the sea shanty assortment also helps elevate the atmosphere. I know, probably not the best clip to pair with that statement. Not every idea that's gone into Resynced has been a wasted effort, and the result has been a competent remake. I'm not sure I'd necessarily call it faithful. It tries to revise certain story elements because it can't be asked to deal with others. It pissed the word faithful away off the bat. But it's competent and it's Black Flag. I'm not surprised that the broader general consensus of it is positive. As much as I've dedicated the vast majority of this video to drawing attention to its gaping flaws, I haven't hated this experience. I've actually quite enjoyed it. But I also see a game that is no return to form. What I see is a golden opportunity for a lesson. And that lesson is, look at how good Black Flag is in comparison to itself. Resynced puts Assassin's Creed at its very best and Assassin's Creed at its worst side by side. And provided the correct lessons are learned from that, that might just be the best thing to happen to this franchise in over half a decade. The only way forward from here is to invest in some serious writing and take some serious risks. Or at least that's how I view it. Ubisoft can't rely on remakes of old greats as crutches. It's Ubisoft we're talking about. They will run out. And this caliber of new narrative content on its own is feeble. Black Flag Resynced may have these problems, but it also, in the original Black Flag story, has the answer. If nothing else, the remake has made that abundantly clear. And with that, I bring this video to its conclusion. Do I recommend Assassin's Creed Black Flag Resynced? I find that question hard to answer, but in the arena of remakes, you can most certainly do a lot worse. Nevertheless, it still conforms to the norm of remakes being ever so slightly weird, and yeah, as I've painstakingly elaborated, the new writing makes you feel as if you've been lobotomized. Next question, do I think the rumoured Assassin's Creed 1 remake is a good idea? No, I think I'd feel duty-bound to be way harsher on that, on principle. Black Flag is almost certainly less offensive to remake. After all, it's a well-aged pirate fantasy set in the West Indies, which probably doesn't look far off most people's idea of paradise. In that respect, updating the visuals isn't unwelcome. It's also not designed intentionally by its limitations like AC1 was, so Black Flag was way easier to preserve the fantasy of, but hey, I'd probably be better served saving that for another time, if indeed that crops up. And with that, I thank you all for watching. I really hope that you've enjoyed this lengthy beast of a video. I hope it's provided you with some insight on my scattered thoughts about this game. As for anyone wondering if hell has frozen over, it would seem so. I'm making videos about Assassin's Creed again. Should you expect any of Hex? I don't know. We'll have to see, won't we? I've not heard anything about it that makes me violently ill, so that's a positive. Anyway, if you did enjoy this video, be sure to go ahead, leave a like, maybe subscribe, share the channel with your friends, all that wonderful stuff. It would be massively appreciated. And if you want to join us over on Discord, be sure to follow the QR code on screen now. If you can put up with my rambling for any length of time, you are more than welcome. But either way, with any luck, I'll be seeing you all very soon with another video at some point. But until next time, please take care, and goodbye. Do you reckon the photo mode shots I've taken with Margaret Thatcher sails are going to appear on unsuspecting players' maps? I hope so.